know that today's workshop is going to be so amazing that we're going to put it on our YouTube channel to have people access it that way. So thank you so much for having me this morning. And I'm really looking forward to this. Both of us have older children. My son is 20. You're going to tell us about your son in the course of the workshop. And I do this work to share the lived experience and hopefully shave off 5 to 7 years of a learning curve for other families. FND, as many of you know, you're on our page, was founded in 1985 in Pinellas County in a living room with a group of parents just like us that really wanted to help make education for their children better and systemic changes. And that's what we've done in the course of the last 35 years. We are a nonprofit. We are funded by the Federal Department of Education as a parent training information center. And with that, this will be our first time announcing live on Facebook that we were awarded the 2020 through 2025 grant. And I'm very excited about that. As a matter of fact, all of our three projects for FND and the PTIs were re-awarded their grants. Our regions will look a little bit different. Penn has grown. We now have 12 counties instead of 10 counties, and we stretch from Monroe County up the East Coast and up through Lake County, just north of Orange County. Um, Luke and I, we are not therapists, even though I personally feel like I've had enough therapy in my lifetime to be a therapist. We are not attorneys. We are not advocates. We are individuals with lived experience that share that experience, strength, and hope to help you navigate those joys and challenges that you will experience with your children. So, Luke, I am going to hand it back to you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can jump into you telling us exactly what substitute decision making is.
Okay, well, I always struggle with what to share about myself because our journeys have been so complex and so detailed in so many different ways. But I guess for the purposes of this workshop, what's really important for the audience to understand is that I am the parent of a young person who lives with significant and profound disabilities that began at the age of 2.5 when he was placed in my home as a foster child originally. And of course, I adopted him later. My son has had an extraordinary journey that I just happened to be able to participate in as a parent and an advocate. And, like you talked about that learning curve, and that learning curve is very real, particularly for those of us who have children that don't fall into a nice, neat little category or diagnosis that is commonly known and commonly understood for our children, particularly our children who live with organic damage to their brain or who live with unseen disabilities or that emotional and behavioral component. Our children oftentimes get placed into a category not only by educators, but also by the professionals who serve them and our support systems around us, that their behavior, their disability appears to be a willful act rather than a manifestation of a disability. And it took me a long time to be able to learn how to recognize the manifestation of my son's disability and then learn how to advocate for him and help those around him understand how best to support him and to truly see his potential. Because, like many other families and like many other individuals who live with disability, everyone around him put limitations on him. He was never supposed to be able to live in the community as an independent adult. I was told so many horrible, horrible things about my son by the professionals in his life that had I listened to them, my son would be living in an institutionalized environment today. And that is not the case. I am so grateful to have found that peer-to-peer support early on in my journey, to have learned from some amazing individuals. And I have used and leveraged those skills that I've learned by working with my son and other professionals to be able to support families whose children live with complex disabilities that oftentimes put their placement in jeopardy. And I've been doing that for 23 years now. So I have extensive experience in working with not only the special education system, but the many other systems of care that serve our community and our families and those that I've supported over the years.
You know, Luke, you remind me of something that happened with us, and I think that the stories are why families relate to us. When my son had his first really profound episode, he was 5 years old, and the therapist said to us, don't save for college for this child, save for an attorney because he'll be in jail by the time he's 16. And I am so grateful that you and I did not listen to those professionals. And what I encourage our viewers is you are your child's best advocate. And you know in your gut, in your heart, even if you don't know the technical aspect of it or the mechanics of it, you know what is in the best interest of your child. And that's what F&D is here for, is to walk you through that technical and the like I said, the mechanics of it. What are systems of care? What is special education? How do we navigate that? And Luke, what is substitute decision making?
Well, I really prefer, when we're going to talk about substitute decision making, let's really look at the language that is used by the Florida Department of Children and Families. And that language very specifically states substitute decision making gives guardians the right to make personal decisions on the behalf of individuals who live with disabilities. So, what does that really mean? I know that's what you're going to ask me, Allie. And what it really means is that we're talking about guardianship. It means that although our loved one who lives with a disability reaches the age of majority, that age of 18, someone else is awarded guardianship or is appointed as the guardian to make decisions on their behalf.
So, you know, actually, about 5 years ago, you were the one who had introduced me in another world and another lifetime of strength based language. And in that thought of strength based language, we then talk about what is substitute decision making. So, you know, what tell us a little bit about your journey and how you learned, not substitute, I'm so sorry, supported that strength-based language of supporting our youth. Tell us a little bit, you know, how and why you decided to use that strength base and that supported model versus that actual guardianship and you know your son losing his very important rights just as a human and a citizen.
So I think it's important that if we're going to talk about that, to really understand the context of what was taking place at the time. Right around the time my son reached 16, we had already been through so many hospitalizations. We had received some excellent care, and we truly had what I believe is an accurate diagnosis, and I think it still sticks today. A challenge that occurred, though, is that as many of our children who live with disabilities do, they dislike the side effects of their medications. And my son had learned this nifty little trick of taking his medications in front of me, being able to show me that they were no longer in his mouth, but he would hold them in his throat. And then he would spit them out. And what happened with the type of medication he was on is that it became toxic in his system. It can't be taken intermittently. We were trying to figure out why he was decompensating, why he all of a sudden went, I mean, because he was headed on this beautiful path. We had secured a place for him at Atlantic Technical Center. He was going to complete his high school education while working towards college credits to give him a trade and be able to carry that forward with education. And this decompensation was so profound that my son reached a very volatile state, and he became unsafe for himself. He became unsafe for those around him. He became unsafe to live in the home. And we did our best to try and stabilize him outside of that, outside of a hospital environment, because we really only did that when it was absolutely necessary. And unfortunately, it became necessary. That young man who was unable to be stabilized on medications looked like an individual who would not have the ability to live independently. So I started the very lengthy process of establishing substitute decision making or guardianship. And we're very fortunate that we live in a state that takes this very seriously. In fact, Florida, Georgia, and Michigan are three states that expressly state that the individual has the right to have their autonomy and rights restored at the earliest possible time. And they also make sure that there's a very stringent process of validating the need for guardianship and taking those rights away for the first place. So while we were going through this process, establishing the three different independent evaluations to prove that he truly needed to have guardianship and going through those processes, we simultaneously did our best to work with him to establish a supported decision making environment, to give him every possible opportunity to learn the independent living skills, to develop those self determination skills that he needed to live as an independent adult. And I'm very happy to report that by the time we were ready to go to court, I was looking at my son and very clearly was looking at a young man who did not need those supports any longer. Supportive decision making for our family worked. And so my son today continues to live in the community right alongside his non disabled peers in his own condo, in a community that he loves on a major bus route. And he is very independent from many different aspects. He's grown into such a wonderful, self determined young man who still lives with disabilities. They still manifest, they still cause challenges in his life, but we wrap him with support in the areas that he needs and only in those areas that he needs, because we want to continue supporting the continued development of those skills so that he can continue to advance and grow forward.
Yeah, wait, it's so funny because when you share your story, I believe at one point you genuinely believe that your son was not going to live independently, and he is. And I believed my son would live independently, and he's still with us, which I'm happy to have him with us. I want him to find his independence when he's ready, but I also want to set him up for success for that. And so while I see you're going to say something here in a second, go ahead.
Interrupt you.
That's okay.
I want to interrupt you because when my son was your son's age, we were still working on a lot of those skills. And if I had the ability for him to be in my home, I would have. It just wasn't possible for us because of the nature of the challenges he had. And then, of course, we finally reached a point where he was absolutely safe to come back home. And I really struggle with my desire as dad to have him back in the house. But I was able to very clearly look at it that if I brought him back for him, that would be regression by that point in time. So don't give up hope. Your son is going to accomplish these things when he is ready, just like my son accomplished them when he's ready.
And I think it's really important, in today's world, many times you will hear that phrase, and I'm going off script for a half a second, Luke, cultural competencies. But I think it's much more important to think about cultural responsiveness. And I've shared many, many times. I have been married to my husband for 22 years, and he is a Jamaican man. He's a first generation Jamaican man. So he lived with his mother, other than in the dorm at university, until we got married. And he was well into his 30s. And that was a completely culturally appropriate for him. So throughout our conversation today, I think one of the foundational principles that I think is very important for our audience to remember is this is a very individual decision. You have to make this decision with all of the information and supports of what are the needs of your individual young adult and your family. And if I keep looking down, I just want you guys to know that I'm following our chat box in case anybody has any questions while they are watching us. So while Luke and I are very strength-based persons, we definitely had our share of barriers. So I think I want to talk a little bit, Luke, about what some of those barriers were and the strategies through our lived experience that we had to get around those barriers and then maybe help other parents get through them a little bit quicker or even recognize them so they don't happen in the first place.
Well, when it comes to barriers, there's a lesson that I finally learned that I wish I had been able to embrace earlier. Oftentimes we as parents, we don't trust ourselves. We have these people that have these big letters behind their name, and lots of them have not just a few different letters, but they've got strings and strings of letters with commas. And so we're just parents and we feel inept, or we feel
Just
like, yeah, we feel like maybe we're wrong. And so for the longest time, I parented my child strictly based upon um, what I was being told I had to do by the professionals in my life. And of course, our circumstances are very unique. Dion was raised by two dads. And there were multiple points in times in our life where we had to legally protect our rights to be his father, even though the adoption had been finalized. So there was a bit of fear on my part to stray away from what the professionals were saying, for fear that that would be somehow leveraged to take my son away from me. And there eventually became a point in time, once I had successfully established my right to be my son's father a couple of times, I finally got to the point where I really started listening to myself. So the first barrier I had to remove was my inability to trust myself and to move forward with raising my son in the way that my gut, my heart told me that was the case. And then once I was able to do that, the very next barrier that I recognized I needed to tackle was that of the educators and the treatment teams and professionals around him, who simply would not listen to him, who simply would not listen to me. They saw his auditory processing disorder, the way that manifests for him, his inability to understand the verbal language in the way that most people are able to do so. And they saw his inability to communicate as willful defiance and lack of respect or willful disrespect to them. They couldn't understand that he's not hearing the words that you're saying. We need to make him paraphrase what he believes he understood so that we know that those words are right. And that's organic damage to his brain that has caused this. He can't help that. That will never go away. However, it's one of the many things that people forget about first off. And so then when he has to struggle, that, well, we've told you, how many times do we have to tell you this same thing over and over again? You just don't want to do this. And I heard that so many times. And you know how crushing that is for a young person who's really doing their best and who really doesn't understand why they don't understand things. And that's just one example, but really learning how to move myself first out of the way, to trust myself, and then being vigilant and holding those folks accountable for his treatment, for his care, and his education to the clinical documents that they created and to the IEP or TIEP, transitional IEP, that was created, and holding them accountable for remembering how his disability manifests, what that looked like for him, and forcing the fact that forcing everyone to use the intervention strategies and accommodations that were put in place because we all agreed to this. Sometimes I know it's really easy to happen, but when we get frustrated with our children, when we get frustrated as educators, when we get frustrated as professionals and don't know what to do, something happens emotionally. And I think sometimes we forget about all the things we know when we're interacting with our young people who live with disabilities. And I know that was a big long ramble to answer your question, but I think it's really important that we have to realize that we as parents can be our first and most significant barrier. Once we can recognize that, once we learn how to trust ourselves, once we learn how to advocate, and once we're no longer afraid of the professionals that seem to govern our lives, then we can truly embrace our nature as parents, because we do know our children better than anybody. We do tend to understand their disabilities better than most. And even though we may need some help and guidance from professionals to learn how to be more effective at that, we still have to learn how to trust ourselves. And that is absolutely key.
I think it's really important that the viewers, know, and I didn't say this at the beginning, everybody at F&D, from our CEO right down to our part-time parent trainer or administrative support, they have a child with a disability or themselves have a disability. And what I absolutely love about our Penn team is our experience is really diverse, because as your PTI, we are serving families from birth, from when they're born, and they're utilizing that Part C and early steps through transition, when they exit high school with their FAPE, whether they graduate at 18 or they stay to 22 with their deferment options. So even though today we're primarily talking about those young adults and that transition at age of majority, um, I remember one of our experiences, Luke, and we talk about this so many times about our children being, you know, negatively impacted by people not believing that the behavior or the lack of behavior really was a manifestation of that disability. And my son's eligibility was EBD, which is that emotional behavioral disability. Um, and he he went from 0 to 60 really fast, and he could calm himself down, but it wasn't a real calm, you know? So, like, I want you to have that visual of boiling eggs, right? And a pot gets that real hard boil on the eggs going, and you turn it off, and the water may no longer be boiling, but you're not going to stick your hand in that pot and reach out those eggs, right? They're still hot. And that was, and I've never used that analogy, and I really, really like it. But that was exactly how his manifested himself, you know. And I think the other part of the barriers that I want to touch on, and I'm going to borrow this from Project 10, our partners there, she quoted, I believe it was Les Brown, that says, "No one rises to low expectations." So, you know, it's very important. And I think we pretty much all of us have high expectations for our children, but to remind those other people who are supporting our children, whether it is that TIEP team or the treatment team after graduation, that they continue to have those high expectations of that child. And one of the subjects that we're going to jump into in a few minutes, that's one of my favorites, is letting them earn their own experiences. So I think this is where I jump in for a minute on the TIEP, Luke, or do you want to say something?
Well, I think I just want to, I just wanted, because you really already said it, but I just want to make sure that as we're talking about barriers, you know, one of the things that naturally happens is as our children become older, as they move towards adulthood, those adults around them who may have been supporting them wonderfully all these years tend to begin to look at the manifestation of the disability as something that can be controlled by the young person. You're old enough to know better now, or whatever the language is. But we've heard so many different phrases, right? And remembering it's hard that even though you're looking at somebody who for us is in their 20s now, right? They still, the disabilities still manifest in a way that they cannot control their experience all the time. They still have to employ their coping strategies. We as parents still have to remember how best to support them. And so do their treatment teams as they move into adulthood. You know, and then I really want to just piggyback on what you said. When you have significant needs, adults tend to lower their expectations, which, in my opinion, truly limits that youth's ability or opportunities for success. And I really want to encourage everyone out there to really, you know, don't do that. Really, just don't do it. Just don't do it. But instead, work to begin to stretch those abilities. See, you know, what you're going to talk about the TIP here and the goals that we write into our educational plans and into our treatment plans really should be designed to stretch the capacities of our young people who live with disabilities to begin assessing and truly determining what is within their capabilities and how their opportunities for success may manifest or may look for them as they move into adulthood. And with that, I'll shut up and let you talk about the TIP.
No, and I want to thank Kate for joining us, and we have a few other people on. So just to remind you, if I look down, I'm just looking at the notes to make sure who has joined us. And I hate reading slides, but when we were planning and we came up with our agenda and we wanted to make sure we had our tools to do as great a job as possible to make sure we didn't forget any information, because you could have a full 8-hour seminar on substitute to supported decision making and guardian, and we're condensing it down to an hour in those broad points. So definitely call us or email us if you need that individual support. But specifically on the TIP, the Transition Individualized Education Plan, it sets forth that plan with specific goals when the child, it starts at 14, the planning part, and then the transition goal, the team must include by 16, to develop self-determination skills and prepare the youth for an independent life after graduation, as independent as possible. And studies show that children with strong self-determination skills and strong advocacy skills, they have a higher quality of life, you know. And I talk about this so much. When our kids are still little, we use that phrase, use your words, use your words, use your words, because, many of the children we serve have a significant issue with language acquisition. And so we want them to say something and we want them to say something. And then when they turn into a teenager, we want them to shut up. We want them to shut up. No, 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 no. If your child, and it doesn't have to be words. Our children communicate through their body language. They communicate through assistive technology. They communicate through sign language. There's so many different ways of communicating, but it is so important that we do listen to the child when they are communicating. And one of my favorite phrases, and it's all over the place, is behaviors are just a form of communication. We may not like what they are saying or doing in their behavior, but they're absolutely trying to tell us something. So, one of the questions that we get so very frequently is, what do I do when the IEP team or the TIEP team, the school team, doesn't listen to me? Writing. Put it in writing. Even if you have a conversation in the car loop, or you went in, maybe they were sick when we were in brick and mortar. Of course, we're recording this in October, and some of our counties are just now returning back to school. But say you're in that front office picking up your kiddo when they're not feeling well. Maybe that not feeling well is really an avoidance strategy. And so one of the things that I always did when I really wanted to make sure that the team would hear me is I would put it in writing. And I would try and be really collaborative, and thank you for having that discussion with me in the office. I know it was really brief, but here were some of my takeaways, and who is going to be responsible in helping us support that. Sometimes I've had to get a little more assertive of, well, that part of his manifestation is he really, really, really struggles with executive functioning, and deadlines are a real challenge for him. And his support facilitator or case manager or ESC specialist, whatever your county uses for that term, they really have written into that TIP consultation. Are they really following through? So when your team is not listening to you, and I know we get tired by the time we get to high school, um, it's really important to put it in writing, but it's also really important to just not, give up on that. Did you have anything to add to that point, Luke?
I do actually. And it is highly situational, right? The reason the IEP team or the reason a professional may not be listening to you is going to be based upon your individual circumstances and what's going on. And and I really do. I know I say this over and over and over again, but it is true. With only a couple of exceptions in the last 23 years, just about everybody, I mean, really, truly, only a couple of exceptions in 23 years, everyone that was around the table at the IEP meeting or a treatment team meeting was truly there with my son's best interest in mind. And there was something there that prevented everyone from seeing things from the same perspective. And sometimes we as parents forget that we are 50% of the IEP team. And we forget how much power we as parents have and our ability to follow procedural safeguards and do the things that we can legally do to protect our children's rights. And sometimes we just have to find different strategies to help folks see things, put things that you like to do things in writing. And I advise, that's definitely great. But the circumstances are always part of what needs to be taken into consideration. So the only thing that other point that I'd like to add is, if you feel your IEP team is not listening to you and you've tried putting things in writing and you're still not able to get those results, reach out to us, talk to us about what's going on. Let us offer you our perspective and give you some guidance on how you can help the IEP team or the treatment team hear you and learn how to present your child's case in a way that can move things forward rather than keeping you stagnant, or worse yet, you backing down because you feel intimidated that the IEP team holds all the power.
The other thing that I really learned kind of the hard way was the high school teachers. In my son actually went to a magnet high school. Now he was in a center school. We experienced that entire continuum, other than residential, and we were almost there. But thank goodness for our family, we did not have to do that. But in high school, at one of the technical high schools that was a magnet program and had lots of requirements, there was still a huge resistance of, you know, this is intentional. He doesn't really need an IEP. You're just a pushy mom that made this happen because he had big behaviors as an elementary school student, you know. So one of the things that I did that's another strategy is all of our children are general education students first, period. Period. They are general education students first and in high school to be served by that guidance counselor, that college counselors. Some counselors call it brace, other counties have different names for it. But your child is not solely the responsibility of the special education department or the ESE department. So, saying all of that, one of the things that was a big strategy that I used in high school to facilitate that supported decision making was I had parent teacher conferences every single quarter. And I had them the fifth week of every single quarter. Now, why did I have them on the fifth week of the quarter? Because that was right after interim reports were sent out. And it gave my son 4 weeks to fix whatever he needed to fix. It was a good opportunity for us to check in. And it also showed that I was an engaged parent. Was it exhausting? Absolutely. You know, our high school students have anywhere between 6 and 8 teachers. And, you're never going to be able to meet with all 8 or 6 teachers at the same time. But being very consistent that this was the way that I was going to operate, that I was going to leverage his right as a general education student and have those parent teacher student conferences. I got to model how to handle potentially confrontational situations. And then he got the opportunity to speak what his needs were in a very supported way. Like, even if I hated what he said, I never corrected him in front of the teacher. It was like, this is the natural consequences. We were also a real big family on natural consequences. I would definitely have that conversation after we left the room, and typically my strategy would be, so why don't you tell me a different way we could have said that? Because I wanted him to think about what he was doing. And then the other thing that I want to talk about before, Luke, you share with us what your son's life looks like now, is that scaling back. When our children have those IEPs, not only is it those specialized direct services, but it is the accommodations. So, for my son as a child with that, a young adult with that emotional behavioral disability and that impulse control, he needed a break. And genuinely, legitimately, to this day, we actually use the word purple banana. And if he says purple banana to me, I know I have to leave him alone for like at least an hour. Like, he's maxed out, he doesn't want to blow up. And that's one of his strategies. But in school, he had a little card, and it was his stress walk card, and everybody in his classes knew that if he was self advocating that he needed to take a stress walk, he just would flash his card and he got to walk out of class. Of course, we worked on the boundaries of really try and stay through the lesson. Don't leave until they got to the independent work section, like a lot of those things. But my whole point about that is, if your child is going to be in the workforce, which a majority of our children are, or they're going to move on to post secondary college or trade school, many of our students will. There's no stress walk. And what that looks like in real life is walking off a job. And we've had to learn that in a really, really difficult and painful way. He graduated 2 years ago in 2018, and I think he's had 7 or 8 jobs since then. So we kind of use a lot of humor and joke of, well, he can get a job. He has those social skills to get employed. He has those independent skills to find something, but he was still working on the emotional skills on what happens when it calls a frustration threshold, when he just reached that maximum. You can't say purple banana to your boss, right? So when our children are in high school, if they are utilizing that type of accommodation, just again, experience, strength, and hope is really important to look like, is that accommodation something that can be realistically translated into the quote adult community? So,
Had a similar experience. I think oftentimes, and I really want to make sure I use my impeccable language here because I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. Um, we struggled with scaling back those accommodations. In fact, I mean, very passionate debates from both sides. And I finally had a teacher just look me in the eyes and say, Mr. Wilson, I still have a classroom to maintain, and forcing your child to skip his stress walk causes chaos in my classroom. I don't care if he's graduating high school soon, I'm giving him his stress walk. And that is valid. I mean, we do have to recognize the limitations of the classroom, but let me tell you what that looks like once we've graduated. It results in going to programming. My son was not able to move on to his education. He's just now getting ready to go back to school because he's finally ready. But before then, we had him in supported programs. And let me tell you, standing toe to toe with the director of a supported employment program who's trying to get you ready for a job she was very hopeful he would be able to have, and in telling her in no uncertain terms you're taking your stress walk and walking out of the building results in a lot of problems. It also results in a lot of problems when you tell the police officer that you need to step away or whatever the other circumstances are. Our young people who live with disabilities somehow have to learn how to navigate the world around them that does not care about their disability, is not likely going to recognize it, is most likely going to see what's happening to them as something that is willful or chosen rather than seeing those disabilities. And I want to be mindful and remind all of our parents that we also need to make sure that our children are aware of the resources that are out there for them once they've reached adulthood and they are in times of crisis. They can request someone from the crisis intervention team with Broward County Sheriff's Office or the local police. They can request assistance from mobile crisis if they need it. And there's many other things that are out there, but we do have to really begin scaling back those accommodations and then replacing them with new skills that can be utilized in the real world today, outside of the educational classroom.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I just saw a post that down in Monroe County, one of the counties that we serve, the Key West Police Department now has sensory boxes in their unit cars. So it is, if you are experiencing a crisis with your child, regardless of what their disability is, you can use that language calling 911. I have a child with a disability. I need someone to come out and you know, who can handle that type of situation. So I think Luke is going to pull up a screen because there are 6 talking points on there, and we're already about halfway through our time. So we're going to definitely spend a good amount of time on this, but we may have to go through the rest of our agenda a little bit quickly. But these are some of the supports that you can that you want to figure out and how to work on with a in that supported decision making. And we had a quick question from Rachel, and I think she wants us to repeat what we can request from. So Luke and I both happen to live in Broward County, but Penn does serve 12 counties. And they all have city police officers or a county police organization. The term that Broward uses, and if I'm not mistaken, it is a statewide term, is called CIT, a crisis intervention team. Is that the T, Luke?
Yeah.
And those are police officers that have additional training on how to support persons with disabilities or persons with crisis. I believe they use the CIT team for individuals that are in a substance use crisis also. But thank you for asking that question, Rachel. And when we're done with our webinar here, we're going to put a lot of resources in those comment boxes. So Luke, I'm going to let you jump right into some of these kinds of support that we can ask for.
Okay, so before we jump into that, what we really need to first realize is that supported decision making looks different for everyone. And the goal of supported decision making is to offer our young people who live with disabilities support, but only in those areas in which they truly need support. So the concept that we're going with today, because we're just facilitating a conversation here, is I'm going to use my family as an example of what supported decision making looks like for my son today. And now be mindful that we've already taken a lot of the steps in a lot of the other areas to build the self-determination skills and the independent living skills, the logic, the problem solving, all those skills have been slowly developing over time. And so today, my son receives supports in many different areas. And so we'll just go down the list here. From a financial advice standpoint, my son is still not yet at the point where he can be his own payee. He does receive supplemental security income because of his disability. He is unable to work at this time, but he's moving very quickly in that direction. In fact, before the pandemic, he had actually secured a job at a movie theater, which of course was one of the first things that had to close down. It was a real blow for him, but he's handling it well. But anyway, financial advice is something that he needs. Now, he is not his own payee, but that does not mean that he has no control over his finances. We really work with him to help him understand his budget, how much his rent is, how much his electricity is, his other utilities, his discretionary funds that he has every month, how much money he has for his groceries. We offer him the guidance and the support, and we have controls and checks and balances put in place to help him learn how to manage his finances on his own, and to also understand the repercussions of things like impulse buys that happen at the counter as you're getting ready to check out, or whatever the case may be, so that he understands if he spends X amount of dollars on this item that he just really wants to have right now, it means that those funds aren't available for another area, and we have to find a place in the budget from where it can come. When it comes to medical advice, my son has multiple challenges here. As I mentioned earlier, he lives with an auditory processing disorder. And so when it comes to medical advice, what we have learned works best for him and for our family is my son takes the lead on scheduling all of his appointments. He gets himself to all of his appointments. And we have worked very hard to make sure that all of his medical providers understand his need to conference me in at an appropriate time in the session. Because even though doctors and educators or providers oftentimes have the ability to understand what it means to live with an auditory processing disorder and all the many other diagnoses my son has, experiencing it and learning how to work around it is something that takes time. So I am there to help make sure my son understands the information, make sure the communication with the doctor is facilitated well, and then after that appointment, I spend time with my son to help him make sure he truly understands the medical concepts, the treatments that were offered, the medications that were recommended, and we do our research together so that he can understand the positive and negatives of every single choice, and he ultimately makes the choice as to what he wishes to do from a medical standpoint. It's his body, it's his life, it's his right, is the approach that I take. And we sometimes disagree, and that can be hard for me as a dad. However, I have to realize I'm working with a young man here, not a little boy anymore, right? When it comes to employment advice, I'm completely out of that. That falls into the realm of a job coach. I certainly have any conversations my son would like to have with that. I encourage him that he has the ability to do anything he wants once he sets his mind to it. He's accomplished everything he's ever set out to do. But he has someone very specifically trained to work with him on developing those employment skills, and that falls in her area. When it comes to independent living, my son has been living independently since he was 18 years old. I can't teach him much more than that. And although we have members of the treatment team that don't really care for how he chooses to keep his apartment, I would challenge many folks to walk into the home of any other 24-year-old man and then walk into my son's place and tell me my son's place isn't kept better than most. So he really doesn't need anything there. When it comes to school related advice, he's actually working with his life coach. I certainly offer feedback and allow him to discuss and share whatever he wants there, but he's working with someone, a professional whose job it is to help him learn how to submit his college application, to submit his financial aid forms, and to choose his educational programming. And when it comes for personal care advice, he's pretty much capable of handling all those things, but I still have to provide the checks and balances of, hey, buddy, your skin's looking really ashy today. When's the last time you put on lotion? When's the last time you made a haircut appointment, or whatever the case may be. But for the most part, he does really good in all these areas. It's just a matter of helping him gain those skills that have yet to develop naturally for him, and then helping him overcome some of the challenges that the manifestation of his disability can present for him from time to time.
So I wasn't going to speak on this slide, but I think it's really important to show the similarities and the differences. I'll go through our experience just really, really quickly. When Luke spoke about financial advice, what came to my mind is auto pay. I really had to remind him, for whatever you have on your Apple Auto Pay or your Xbox Auto Pay, it reminds me of the saying when I was a kid, which I don't think a lot of younger people would know today. What do you mean I'm out of money? I still have checks. you know, um, and medical advice for us, I really have to do the first appointment with him. Part of his mental health does result in a real low level anxiety, and first experiences are definitely a challenge for him. But he has just turned 20, and he now schedules and keeps all of his appointments. He has experiencing some physical issues now where he has to see a physical therapist on a regular basis. And that took about a year to have happen regularly. Employment, that's one of those things where I really had to embrace natural consequences. And I'd like you, he does not use a job coach. And I do want to touch on vocational rehabilitation in a moment, for just a moment. But I'm not involved in the employment advice at all, other than being a supplementary alarm clock. Are you going to be up and on time? Independent living, he still has chores here. He still has accountability that he must do here. And he also knows that he needs to keep his gas tank full. My son is able to drive, even though he did use a bus as his primary transportation from seventh grade all the way through his sophomore year in college. School related advice, that conversation is just way too long for this particular workshop. I will support him in his school related experiences as much as he will allow me to. And again, that has to go with natural consequences. And then the personal care is very similar to Luke's. It was like, did you shower today? Are you going to do that? Do I need to get you some more mouthwash? Because he does live at home with us. Um, for our students and the community that we serve, everybody has a 504 or an IEP plan, individualized education plan, or 504. If your child has that disability, you have the access to vocational rehabilitation, which is also known as VR. So we will put that link in the comments later. And on one of our other workshops that we have that's called Transition Services, we go into vocational rehabilitation at a significant length. So I just wanted to touch on that for the moment, so to plant a seed on that. Luke, I want you to share your quote with us. I absolutely love your quote about judgment.
Oh, well, it's a hard, this is really hard for a lot of parents to accept, because we really want to do, I mean, it's in our nature. We want to protect our children to the best of our abilities. We want their experience to be better than ours. And I think we sometimes forget that good judgment comes from experience, and that experience comes from poor judgment. And oftentimes we get in the way as parents because we have such a desire to protect our children. We don't let them have that experience that comes from poor judgment. That it's part of learning, it's part of growing. Failure is a part of the process of success. Learning how to accept that failure, learning how to overcome obstacles that get in our way, learning how to manage that disappointment that comes, and learning how to pick yourself up and move forward despite how you might feel about things or your fear of success in the future. It's all part of the process. and everyone learns differently. And as we were talking about earlier, Allie, there are many of us who have to learn our lessons in the most difficult and challenging way possible for them to solidify. And well, it's not just you, it's me too. I don't know what it is about my life and my experiences, but I tend to learn my lessons best when I learn them the very hard way. And oftentimes our children are the same.
I want to reiterate, because we do serve such a wide population, we know that there are a certain segment of our viewers and a certain segment of our families that we serve that really have complex children, and young adults. And what I want to encourage you with everything that we've said today is to have that phrase, as possible, as much independence as possible for your child, as much self-determination as possible for your child. We can't tell you what that looks like for your child. You and your child have to figure that out. One of my favorite, and in education world, we have acronyms out the wazoo, as same as in the recovery world, and I identify as a person in long-term recovery. um, Fail, first attempt in learning. I really, really love that phrase. And when my son is just really devastated about something, maybe he walked out on another job, or maybe he quit going to his class because he was frustrated about it, or maybe he blew up at a friend and now that friend is having a long time to forgive him or rebuild that friendship. I always remind him that, failure is really just that one of those foundational steps in that learning process. Um, so what there's something that you always say about your view of Dion, and his view of him, about his best. Would you mind sharing that with the group? Because I again, I love this saying too. You have such great nuggets.
Oh, you're talking about learning to accept that my son's best is often not what I would like to see as his best.
Nobody can relate to that, people watching.
I think that's really true for any parent, regardless of whether your child has a disability or not. We as parents want so much for our children. We want their lives to be better than ours was. We want them to have more opportunities for success. But it's really, the point that I make, that I follow up with is, it may not be what I would like his best to be, but it is still his best. And as long as he continues to do his best, I continue to be a grateful father. And when I allow my son to follow his process, what I have realized is that he almost always accomplishes precisely what needs to be done. And his best continues to improve over time. I just have to allow him time for his process to come together and solidify the way it needs to for him. And the best thing I can do as dad is to just physically take that step back and say, you know what, this is what this young man needs to be able to learn and grow beyond the point where he's at. And he's going to learn his lessons best when he fails and he overcomes those obstacles on his own. And I can sit there and say whatever I want to say. I can coach, I can guide, but until he actually does that hands on tactile learning, it's not going to solidify for him. And again, even though initially my hopes for him or he may not be meeting the area of expectation that I would like to see, he almost always exceeds it when I allow him to do it in his own way. And that's the greatest gift I think I can give him as dad. I'm here when you need me, buddy. Otherwise, I'm here for your support. I'll guide you. I'll answer your questions. I'll remind you how capable you are. But he really has to do these things on his own for them to work for him and for him to continue to grow.
And this was the area that was really, really challenging for me, Luke, is how do I maintain those high expectations and those high standards for my child, for my young adult, without falling into that critical world, and without falling into well, is that really your best? So there is, I'm not saying that this is a easy thing to figure out. There is definitely a dance between figuring out how to have a high expectation for your child and knowing that your child is doing their best. So he exceeded everything he has done. I think you have exceeded everything that you have done. Um, is there anything that you wish you would have done differently? I mean, he's 24, you've had 22 years of being a dad. That's a lot of time. What are your thought processes on the shoulda, coulda, wouldas?
Well, I want to go back to what you just said there first before I answer that, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
You were talking about that struggle of allowing our children to do their best at things while managing our expectations without lowering them. And let me share what has worked well for our family, and that is shifting the conversation. Rather than coming at things from my perspective, I would really like to see whatever, whatever, whatever. I have learned to embrace just asking questions. Well, that's great, son. What do you think about this? Well, what do you think you did really well? What are the areas of improvement that you have? What are some things that you would like to learn now that you've had this experience? Using those really what we call motivational interviewing style of questions to really help him get to where he needs to be. And that's the real reason why my son has exceeded all the expectations that have been, or limitations that many people attempted to place on him, because he's been given that opportunity to see his own success. Um, when it comes to what I would do differently, well, I don't know. I think one of the things that I would have preferred to learn differently was to trust my gut um, much earlier than I did. Trust that I knew my son as well as I actually know my son. Trust that um, when things didn't feel right, things weren't right. And rather than listening to others out of fear for what could happen, listening to myself and just really, asking for support when I needed, but really trusting my gut, really going with that person centered and strengths based approach, and asking ourselves, are we really accepting our child for exactly who they are? Or are we beginning to see as our children as who we are told they will be? And when I say that, I think back to a session that we had with a woman who's an absolutely amazing therapist. She's really gifted, and this was back when art therapy was the only way to reach my son. I never will forget. She had set up this little test with all these different things to assess all these different areas of his life. And I'll just share one piece of that interaction. There was a very lifelike doll in the room. And the clinical expectation is that my son would see this doll as if it was a child and show compassion and care and show interest, and almost like we imagine our little girls play with their baby dolls. And when my son held the doll in his lap for just a moment and then noticed a group of cars across the room and just tossed it off his lap and went, I was told he had no conscience. I was told that he would never be able to love or form bonds with other people. I was told so many horrible things. And that's just one example of all the many different things that happened over the year. And of course, I knew better than that. But because I didn't trust myself, I allowed the words of that clinician to invade my mind. And I began looking at my son through the lens that he didn't have a conscience, that he didn't have the ability to bond, that he would never be able to love the way or experience love in the way that you or I do. And really, I just, if I could change one thing, I really wish I could have adapted the son of the concept of seeing my son for exactly who he is earlier on, without the influence of the professionals and the others around us. And I'm not saying to disregard those things that we learn from the professionals in our life that help us support our children, because they're very critical. But when they are incongruent with your own knowledge, when they are contrary to what you see in your child, then trust yourself. Trust yourself as parents, and really that's the thing that I would have trusted myself a lot earlier in the process than I did. I would have managed the fears of my son being taken away from me. because of those perceptions. And I would have engaged in the way that effectively became what my son needed much earlier in his life. I mean, we all look back and we do the coulda, woulda, shouldas, and that kind of thing. And I truly believe that everything happened precisely as it was supposed to for both of us to grow. And for that, I am most grateful.
Thank you so much. We did really good. We stayed on our hour mark because that was our goal for today's workshop because we know everybody's time is so valuable. One of the things that will be up this week when you view our page is we had an amazing two-part session with Project 10, and they are the discretionary project that helps our youth from 14 through graduation. And so while Luke's and my conversation today was very anecdotal, and I hope it was inspirational and I hope it was honest and supportive, the workshop, and it's 180 minutes and it's very dense. It has a lot of technical information of what transition looks like and a lot of resources. So we have that recorded already. We will have that up on our page this week. And I'm going to close with just one thing that, again, is another lesson from Luke, and I'll share first. But Luke supports dads. I mean, it's very unique in this world. And we do say the word disability on purpose. And that is an individual choice. But as an organization, we do not believe that disability is a bad word. So that is why we use that. Special needs is what the federal government defines it as. So that's interchangeable. But and we honor everybody's view. If you want to say unique need or different ability, again, that's an individual choice. But one of the things that we do as a change agent is we want to destigmatize that word, um, disability. So in this advocate group that Luke supports, and these group of men that he supports, because we do know that there is a lower engagement from the father and the father figures in our world, he asked this question, and he says, oh, I'm going to get emotional. He says, what would you tell your younger self to support yourself? And I will go first because I'm kind of ambushing Luke with this one. But I think what I would tell myself, and I actually get this from my 12-step world, is I did the absolute very best with what I had at the time as a parent. And to borrow from Maya Angelou, when I knew better, I did better. And so that's what I would tell myself, my younger self, if I had that opportunity to go back. Don't be so hard on yourself. Forgive yourself quicker. And when you know better, you'll do better. So, Luke, is there anything coming to your mind that you would tell your younger self?
Well, thanks for the ambush there, Allie.
Of course. This is what we do.
When I really think back, I when I think back to my younger self, and gosh, I hope I don't get emotional here. I think back uh, to that young father who picked up his foster son that first day, and whose eyes were so widely opened that evening as my son's history came to light. And that it's not an appropriate forum to share that right now, but I remember the difficulty of that day. I remember falling asleep, sobbing in the hallway outside of his door. And I remember making the commitment to do this for my son because I knew he needed it. Um, but I didn't realize how much I needed it. I did not realize the impact that this journey would have on me. And I think if I had the ability to pull that younger version of myself aside, I would acknowledge all of his fears and tell him it's going to be just as difficult and perhaps even more difficult than you thought this was going to be. But it will be the most rewarding experience you have ever had in your life. And you will grow as a person in ways that you did not feel were possible. I would not be the man that I am today were it not for my son. Um, and that's just a fact. I have more compassion than I would have had. I have more patience and understanding than I would have ever had. And I view the world in a way that is very different now than what it was before. And I owe all of that to my son. So I would acknowledge that. I would then encourage myself that even though you're going to have days that you just don't think you can make it another moment, you will. And you will find a community of people out there whose children also live with disabilities, who will connect with you in ways that you did not realize was possible in platonic relationships. And that's just, that's it. I think, I guess I would share my experience, strength, and hope of where I stand today and remind that younger version of me that it's not only possible, it's going to be the best thing you ever did.
I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And please look at our page this week as we introduce new parent trainers, new counties, and a new grant to help support those families that we love. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take good care. And by the way, if you have any questions about today's workshop, you can feel free to leave them in the comments box below. I'd also like to ask you, if you don't mind, give us a like or a love or a care or an I'm angry at you or whatever it is. Let us know the impact that this workshop had on you. If there's any additional information that you would like us to share, please list it in the comments below. And if you have questions or you need assistance, please feel free to email me directly. My email address is lwilson@fndfl.org. Again, that's LWILSON@fndfl.org. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us today. I want you to know that we truly appreciate you. And whatever you do, please do your best to take care. Namaste.
Those schools were next to each other in both instances.
Okay, we have stopped that. Let me stop our recording.